So there's a sense among us people who believe in the Christian God, us Christians, there's a sense among us that although Christianity would truly start and separate from Judaism with the writings about who Jesus was and about how he came to fulfill the law and how he came to perform actions which would forgive the sins, or perform a action which would forgive the sins of all of mankind. Nowadays we hold in the back of our heads the imagery that Christianity would actually be physically actualized through the Roman Empire, through, of course, the it would begin with the reported miraculous conversion of Constantine the Great through the Edict of Milan, and then through Theodosius, which is, I think, how you say his name. Now, you could truly spend a lifetime studying the conversion of Constantine and everything that went into that, the reported message he received from God, and all of the historical writings, or you could say lack thereof, on that event. The actual historical event I want to look at for this, for God and Human Events, is perhaps you could say just as consequential. And for it, it's not Constantine, it's something else. But for it, we only need to note that Christianity is eventually legalized. Constantine converts, there's the Edict of Milan, Christianity is legalized. The East becomes prime, the West loses its influence, and things start happening in Europe. There's Roman influence left in Europe. The pullout began from areas like what is now the UK, things like that, and the West has fallen, and now the East has all of that Roman influence, and Europe has now entered what is the Dark Ages. Now, traditional Christianity still has not forcibly moved north in any meaningful fashion yet at this point. The Christian expansion made by Rome into Europe was rather minimal, with a lot of prevalence in the modern day UK, like I said. St. Patrick comes to mind. Around the year 400, he was in Ireland, and for the most part was converting essentially the whole nation at that point. He was really doing God's work. England, however, still is remaining in a mostly pagan state. Now, there was a little of that Roman Catholic influence left over after the pullout of Rome. That pullout only happened 40 years before the Anglo-Saxons crossed the Channel and immigrated or migrated to what is now the UK. So there's a little bit of that Roman Catholic influence that would play a big part as we go forward. But Europe at this time was dominated mainly by Goths, Visigoths, and Germanic peoples, and they were all pagan. They were all really originally pagan. Like I said, those leftover Roman influences were sprinkled throughout, and as we move into what is traditionally called the Dark Ages, after the fall, the teachings of Arianism really begin to become prevalent in areas like modern-day Spain, or you could call it Hispania, I think is what they call it, and that was among the Visigoths. It comes from, of course, Arius, and it was spread by his people, his kind of cult, you could say. Of course, that was a big deal around the time of Constantine with the Council of Nicaea, things like that. There was a whole thing on Arianism, and it was rejected by the church. So the barbarians, as Rome put it, were people practicing some mix of Arianism and paganism. Local arbitrary paganism is really just how you could say it. Western Rome, of course, eventually falls for numerous reasons, and now everything worth anything has moved east. The East becomes prime, like I said. Now that that's noted, I wanted to look at a historically reported miraculous conversion, which is just as big as Constantine as far as consequences, but is completely overlooked by Constantine and his conversion. And it's one of the, you could say, great-grandfathers of the West. It's Clovis I in the late 5th century. As for the conversion of Clovis, it occurs when what's called the Merovingian Empire was really at its peak. Now, the Merovingian Empire would eventually be kind of morphed, you could say, and become the Carolingian Empire through an order of the church. And this would be the precursor to what would eventually be medieval France. We get a lot of big players in that time. People like Charlemagne, people like Pepin, Charles Martel, all these big players come about because the Merovingians changed into the Carolingians through the church. Now, to get that reported miraculous conversion of Constantine, right off the bat, we have to begin with the source of the information for this Dark Age period, which is not dark, by the way, but we have to begin with the person writing it down, you could say, the historian, it's Gregory of Tours, okay? He gives us the history of these Frankish people in his famous History of the Franks. While he was writing it, it was just called what we would translate to the Histories. He is the main source. There were other smaller sources like Procopius. He was a Greek historian, and he mainly gave an account of kind of the late Merovingian Empire, but as far as like the early and middle eras of the Merovingians, Gregory is really the only source for this time period. In his writings, he gives an account for the rise of the Merovingians from Merovec. You may have heard of him if you've taken like a world history class or a Western history class. You've probably heard of Merovec. He gives the account of the rise, and then he also gives the account of their brief spat with Arianism. They were pagan, but they were actually one of the few people at this time, I guess you could say, that were rejecting Arianism. The Visigoths completely accepted the false teachings of Arianism, but it's kind of cool to see pagans who wouldn't accept the false teachings. That's kind of interesting to me. So he talks about their brief spat with Arianism, as well as their interaction and integration with the Roman influences that were still present in Europe. It is reported that the Merovingians had their own pagan gods, but after interacting with the Roman influences, these pagan gods would essentially just be morphed into the Roman gods, and you could essentially just say they were worshiping the same figures, I guess you could say. At least that's how it's reported. Now, he was one of 18 bishops of Tours. He became bishop in 573 and was born into a higher echelon family. It's said that his father was a senator, so it's not like he's some like Joe Blow on the street. He had an idea of how the world worked, I guess you could say. He wasn't just some random guy writing things down. He does have some Roman influence in his family, as does everyone in Gaul. The influences of Rome are still obvious and scattered throughout Europe, although Rome has fallen some 150 years ago. It's very interesting to see, and one of the themes of the medieval era, this is kind of outside of this, but one of the big themes of the medieval era is it was all about trying to restore the Roman Empire through the Holy Roman Empire. It was all about trying to get back to the glory of what Rome had to offer. Gregory records his famous account of the Merovingians, and we can begin to see Merovec, which is, like I said, the founding father of the Merovingians. He's leading a group of people called the Salian Franks at this time. These were not the Merovingians yet. The Salian Franks, these were Frankish people, which were a subset of the overall Frankish people in the region around France, Germany, Belgium, that area, Netherlands. We would put the Salian Franks today right off the coast of Dover on the other side of the channel, near Dunkirk and what's the other city? Calais. Those were big World War II cities, obviously, and further inland, of course, not just on the coast. Now, Merovec dies in 457, and his son, some sources say his name is Childeric, and some say Chilperic. I guess it doesn't really matter, but the son takes over after Merovec's death. And remember, like I said, Roman influences are still present in the region, and at this time, in fact, the Franks have become, over the years previous, good allies with the Roman government. Now, the son of Merovec dies in 481, and with his death, the ascension of Clovis I comes about. He's 15 years old when his ascension to the throne occurs, and over the next, you could say, 20 years, Clovis starts just performing land grabs, and he really just starts sprawling with neighboring kingdoms, most notably the Alemanni, as well as the Burgundians, and an ex-Roman warlord or an ex-governor, some sort of ex-Roman figure. He begins fighting with him as well. And Clovis decides about halfway in 493 that it's actually time for him to find a wife. He's been fighting most of his life, and he wants to settle down and have a family now. Okay. And this is where Gregory of Tours gives great insight into what was going on inside the kingdom at this time. And I'm going to read it. It looks like it's about 2 paragraphs, but he says, "Now the king of the Burgundians and, wow, I can't say that name. Now the king of the Burgundians and Gundevec of the family of King Athanaric the persecutor, whom we have mentioned before, he had 4 sons, Gundobad, Gogdizgl, gosh knows, Chilperic, and Godemir. Gundobad killed his brother Chilperic with the sword and sank his wife in water with a stone tied to her neck. His 2 daughters he condemned to exile. The older of these, who became a nun, was called Corona, and the younger Clotilda. And as Clovis often sent embassies to Burgundy, the maiden Clotilda was found by his envoys. And when they saw that she was of good bearing and wise, and learned that she was of the family of the king, they reported this to King Clovis, and he sent an embassy to Gundobad without delay, asking her in marriage. And Gundobad was afraid to refuse, and surrendered her to the men, and they took the girl and brought her swiftly to the king. The king was very glad when he saw her, and married her, having already by a concubine a son named Theodoric. So we see here the willingness of Clovis to engage in this marriage diplomacy. We see this a lot in the Middle Ages as well, but we see this sense that if you have a rival who you think it would be better than not to be friends with them, what you can do is you can marry someone in their kingdom, and now you're basically just one big extended family. So your enemies are now your friends, and now there's a sense of shared, what would you say, shared love, I guess you could say. Oh, was that a deer? Shared family. And this was a common way for leaders to really guarantee safety in a particular time where safety may not be the #1 thing on the menu. Instead of fighting your rivals, just marry someone in the kingdom, and then you're just one big extended family. It's called marriage diplomacy. And we saw it a lot in the Middle Ages, and so it makes sense that we see it in the Dark Ages as well. But this is where the whole purpose of this video, God and Human Events, we've barely even talked about God at this point. This is where it all comes to a culmination. Because Gregory is writing that after the marriage, and after they have bore a son, Queen Clotilda, who was traditional Christian, by the way, she begins to try to persuade Clovis, who is still pagan at this time, to convert to Christianity and turn to God. But Clovis is actually refusing. Gregory writes again, "He had a firstborn son by Queen Clotilda, and as his wife wished to consecrate him in baptism, she tried unceasingly to persuade her husband, saying, 'The gods you worship are nothing, and they will be unable to help themselves or anyone else. For they are graven out of stone or wood or some metal, and the names you have given them are names of men and not of gods.'" He later goes on to say that she said, "What could Mars and Mercury do? They are endowed rather with the magic arts than the power of the divine name. But he ought rather to be worshipped who created by his word heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, out of the state of nothingness, who made the sun shine." And she goes on from there. So what we can see is Clotilda is trying to convert her husband to Christianity, but then something terrible happens, which throws a whole spoke or a whole stick in the spokes of the bicycle. Because the queen wanted their newborn son, Ingomer was his name. She wanted him to be baptized Christian. She wanted him to do this, and Clovis allowed it actually. Although he was unhappy and rather unwilling, he did allow for their newborn son to be baptized. Well, that newborn son, Ingomer, who was baptized, dies shortly after. And this was a huge blow. This was a devastating blow to Clotilda's plan to try to get Clovis to convert to Christianity. Gregory again writes, "Meantime, the faithful queen made her son ready for baptism. She gave command to adorn the church with hangings and curtains, in order that he who could not moved by persuasion might be urged to belief by this mystery. The boy, whom they named Ingomer, died after being baptized, still wearing the white garment in which he became regenerate." That's crazy. At this the king was violently angry and reproached the queen harshly, saying, "If the boy had been dedicated in the name of my gods, he would certainly have lived. But as it is, since he was baptized in the name of your God, he could not live at all." To this the queen said, "I give thanks to the omnipotent God, creator of all, who has judged me not wholly unworthy, that he should, wow, I've never seen that word before, dying to take his kingdom, one born from my womb. My soul was not stricken with grief by his sake, because I know that, summoned from this world as he was in his baptismal garments, he will be fed by the vision of God." Amen to that. Okay, so that didn't work out for Clotilda at all. They had another son together, and after a brief sickness, that son was able to recover. They named him Clodomir. And as that newborn son is kind of growing up, Gregory writes that a war broke out between the Merovingians and the Alemanni. The Alemanni was that other Frankish group in the region. They had been fighting for quite a while. This wasn't really something new. It was kind of on again, off again. We would put the Alemanni near like Holland or Belgium, kind of in that area. And this is where Gregory of Tours recounts that miraculous conversion of Clovis. This is where things kind of change, and this is where we can form an argument, a small piece of that overall inductive argument. So there's an overall inductive argument for God, and the conversion of Clovis really can be part of that. There's a battle with the Alemanni called the Battle of Tolbiac. It was fought in 496. Instead of me paraphrasing it, I would rather just read it in his words. It is about 2 paragraphs, but I'm going to read it, and it's really important, I think. Gregory is just a genius at doing this, and he really conveys it in the best way possible, I think. He's just such a clearly written man. Let's see what he says. Okay, he says, "The queen did not cease to urge him to recognize the true God and cease worshiping idols, but he could not be influenced in any way to this belief until at last a war arose with the Alemanni, in which he was driven by necessity to confess what before he had of his free will denied. It came about as the 2 armies were fighting fiercely, there was much slaughter, and Clovis's army began to be in danger of destruction. He saw it and raised his eyes to heaven, and with remorse in his heart he burst into tears and cried, 'Jesus Christ, who Clotilda asserts to be the Son of the living God, who art said to give aid to those in distress and to bestow victory on those who hope in thee, I beseech the glory of thy aid, and the vow that if thou, wow, I can't read this, thou wilt grant me victory over these enemies, and I shall know that power which he says the people dedicated in thy name have had from thee. I will believe in thee and be baptized in thy name. For I have invoked my own gods, but as I find," this is big, "they have withdrawn from aiding me. And therefore I believe that they possess no power, since they do not help those who obey them. I now call upon you. I desire to believe you only. Let me be rescued from my adversaries." And when he said that, the Alemanni turned their backs and began to disperse in flight. And when they saw that their king was killed, they submitted to the dominion of Clovis, saying, "Let not the people perish further, we pray, we are yours now." And he stopped the fighting, and after encouraging his men, retired in peace, and told the queen how he had the merit to win the victory by calling on the name of Christ. This happened in the 15th year of his reign. Then the queen asked Saint Remy, Bishop of Reims, to summon Clovis secretly, urging him to introduce the king to the word of salvation. And the bishop sent for him secretly and began to urge him to believe in the true God, maker of heaven and earth, and to cease worshiping idols, which could help neither themselves nor anyone else. But the king said, "I gladly hear you, most holy father, but there remains one thing. The people who follow me cannot endure to abandon their gods, but I shall go and speak to them according to your words." Gregory then goes on to say that some 3,000 soldiers were baptized along with Clovis I that day, rejecting their pagan ways and accepting Christianity. The only other big thing to note about the conversion of Clovis before we analyze and before I form the argument is that after the conversion of Clovis, he begins to try to push into Visigothic Spain, and he begins to try to fight the Arians. He sees the Arians as heretical and a threat to the church. And I'll talk about that at the end, but that's a big piece of evidence for the fact that his conversion actually did happen in 496 and not at a later date. Some historians want to say like 509, 507. Well, he wouldn't have pushed into Visigothic Spain to fight the Arians, who he says were heretical. He wouldn't have done that if he did not convert in 496. He's reported saying, "I find it hard to go on seeing these Arians occupy a part of Gaul. With God's help, let us invade them. When we have beaten them, we will take over their territory." The Merovingians were able to get all the way to Saragossa, but due to the Arians possessing the relics of St. Vincent, it's reported that they were not able to take the city in that siege. But anyways, 150 years later, Visigothic Spain would accept Christ. All right, let's get to the argument. Now, if overall what I'm trying to talk about is God and human events, or I'm trying to argue for God and human events through something like the conversion of Clovis, we need to talk about the reporter of these historical events, Gregory of Tours. We need to look at his motivations, his intentions, and his paradigm. We need to look at the integrity of Gregory of Tours and the integrity of his sources, which were within the Merovingian Empire. Now, please note that for the time period that Gregory is living in, as well as everyone else living in this time period, believed that God was still, as well as saints and bishops and other figures in the spiritual realm, they believed that they were just as present today as they were in the biblical age. In fact, they did not see a separation between biblical and post-biblical. They saw it all as one big timeline. So you may spring to say that this shows that Gregory can't be trusted. We can't trust what Gregory says about how Clovis prays during the Battle of Tolbiac, and then there's a conversion and the army surrenders or whatever, the king is killed. You may say we can't believe that because Clovis believes automatically that God is interacting with the physical world, and so we can throw everything in the trash and we don't have to believe that. And the thing with that is, what I would like to propose and countering that is that you have to draw a distinction. This is the main point of the whole video, is that you have to draw a distinction between believed causal impacts and real world events. This is absolutely huge. And if you can see this, and if you can trust the integrity of Gregory, which I will show why I think we can, then you have a very convincing piece of evidence for God in the material world with the conversion of Clovis. The argument really is as follows. Even if Gregory thinks that God was behind it, even if Gregory thinks God was interacting in the material world when he caused Clovis to convert, Gregory still reports for any one unit that he thinks God interacted with, he still reports one unit of real world events. He can believe whatever cause he wants, but we still subscribe to the belief that before anything else, Gregory wants to give the accurate account. He wants to give what actually happened. And by the way, of course, he's a bishop, so is there really a motivation to lie? The Ten Commandments are moral absolute in his paradigm, and so if he lies, he's going against everything that his life was built on. Because in his paradigm, he has to stand before God and face his sins. Even if he accepts Jesus, you still have to face those sins. Jesus will wash you clean of those, but you still have to face them. So if he's spouting lies, damaging lies in his work, I just don't think I don't think that would be something he would want to do, right? So above all else, we must hold on to the idea that Gregory is reporting real world events, even if he believes God is causing them. What he believes is causing them is irrelevant. We just have to hold on to the fact that he is reporting real world events to the best of his knowledge. Now, we must, of course, do our part and take any historical account with a grain of salt. That's always a primary assumption when you're dealing with historical writings. But look at this. Gregory describes in his prologue to Book 2 of his, I guess that was the Histories, but in the prologue to Book 2, he says that his only intention and his only plan is to describe the holy deeds of saints and the ways in which whole races of people were massacred. That's not really out of line for a Christian historian at this time. Of course, his writing will have Christian bias because he operates under that paradigm. But again, there's a difference between believed causal influences and real-world events. So can you really say that Gregory is inaccurate because he, let's say, accepts the idea that dead bishops can play a causal role in human events? I don't feel as though that can be a rebuttal to the integrity of Gregory as a source, because we still have to believe that Gregory's primary intention is to give the accurate history and accurate chain of events that really occurred within the Merovingian dynasty. He can believe in whatever he wants, but this is big. He can believe whatever he wants, but he can't manifest events that didn't actually happen. He can't bring events into existence that did not really occur. Under his paradigm, where lying is an absolute sin, he is trying to report the accurate temporal chain of events. Even if he believes that these objective events were inspired by God, that's in a different space. And he can believe that without compromising integrity of what he's reporting for real-world events. As far as I can see, there is no motivation to lie. He wants nothing more than to please God. He knows he will, or in his paradigm, he knows he will be judged by God, and above all else, he wants to keep the commandments. Again, it's not what we think, it's about what we knew that he thought, okay? He wouldn't go against his paradigm, so why would you project and say that he would be going against his paradigm, right? So just to sum that all up, before I move to the second part, just because Gregory thinks the conversion of Clovis was God-inspired is not a statement at all about the actual real-world events, because he is living under a paradigm where the Ten Commandments are morally absolute. Lying is a sin, and that's like 1,000-fold for a bishop in the Dark Ages. Lying is absolutely a sin. Literally, your whole life is built upon the Ten Commandments and trying to please God. So that's that. That's what I wanted to say about Gregory's paradigm. And and his intentions and things like that. I also wanted to talk about Gregory's sources in the Merovingian Empire. You know, someone who does not operate under the theistic paradigm, they most definitely do not believe in some type of miraculous conversion of Clovis, that's for sure. They believe that somewhere along the line, even if Gregory was reporting what he was hearing and his intentions were pure, they would believe that somewhere along the line there was some Christian bias injected into that story, probably coming through the Merovingian Empire into Gregory, because it didn't go straight from Clovis to Gregory, it went through the empire. And they would say that this is where the Christian bias was inserted, and this is where it went awry. So real quick, what do we know about Gregory's sources? Well, we know for one, we know for a fact that it was not just some mumbo jumbo or someone random in the Merovingian Empire. We know that he knew Frankish royalty very well. He was engaged in that political life. Remember, his father was a senator. That's not evidence for him being engaged in political life in his later life, but you know, we knew that he knew Chilperic I, and we know that that relationship was rocky at times. It's written here, and I don't know where this is from, but it's written here that he had personal relations with 4 Frankish kings. I think this may be from Wikipedia, but it's written here that he had personal relations with 4 Frankish kings, Sigebert I, Chilperic I, Guthrum, and Childebert II. And on top of that, he is said to have personally known most of the leading Franks. He was active in royalty as a leading member of the church, so I think we would be allowed to say that he, in some capacity, knew what was going on. Now that that's said, I must admit that this definitely is the weak point of the argument for the conversion of Clovis, or forgotten human events. It's the Frankish royalty who would have been passing the story of Clovis's conversion, or the account from Clovis to Gregory. The weak point would not be in Gregory, for sure, I don't think. And given that Gregory is himself pretty much all we have for this period, there's not much on the sources on who would have been giving it to Gregory when Gregory himself is the biggest source of the time. However, if you could ever show that the Frankish royalty were being truthful in what they said to Gregory, we'll never really know, but if you could show that they weren't blatantly lying about what happened to Clovis, who was one of the biggest figures at the time, then you have a very convincing post-Jesus argument for God. Now, I think it would be a little hard to, not totally hard, but it would be a little hard to make the case that the Frankish royalty were lying, because there's so much connected to the conversion of Clovis. It's not just like Clovis just converted by himself and like nobody saw it or whatever. There was the conversion of Clovis, then there was what Clotilda was doing. Clotilda called the bishop of Reims to come baptize Clovis, and as well, along with that, there's the 3,000 soldiers who were reported to reject paganism and accept Christianity. And then on top of that, there's the defeat of the Alemanni, and the acceptance of Clovis as as the winner of that battle, right? So there's all these little things connected with the conversion of Clovis. So it's going to be a little harder to say that he's lying, that the Frankish royalty is lying. Now, it wouldn't be impossible, but perhaps that would make it a little harder to make that case. So overall, the inductive argument, or the little piece of evidence for the overall inductive argument that comes from the conversion of Clovis, is not in the fact that Gregory believed that the conversion of Clovis was God-inspired. That's completely irrelevant. What the argument really is about is the fact that there was a complete 180-degree turn for Clovis, from a full rejection of Christianity with the death of his son. Remember, that son was trying to be baptized and died shortly thereafter, and there was a violent rejection of Christianity, to sometime later a complete acceptance of Christianity, which just so happened to be after the Battle of Tolbiac. It's not in the fact that Gregory thought it was God-inspired, it's in the fact that there was a complete 180-degree turn, death of the son to a complete acceptance. That's where the little piece of the inductive argument that comes from Clovis comes from. Now, if you want to talk about the overall inductive argument for God, any one little observation or any one piece of evidence is like a single stick that can be broken, right? It can maybe not totally be refuted, but it can be brought into a neutral space where you can essentially just forget about it and say, yeah, maybe this is whatever, but we don't have to look at it because it's just one small piece of evidence. But the great thing about an inductive argument is that you can get a whole bunch of sticks, you could get a bundle of sticks, you could say, and now you have a very now you have a stronger argument. Those sticks, that bundle can't be broken as easily. Famously, we cannot deduce God from the physical world, so this is how it has to be. But when you start collecting arguments from different fields, you know, arguments from, that's funny, arguments from prophecy, arguments, cosmological arguments, moral arguments, arguments from the Gospels, apologetic arguments, you know, the fact that his body really wasn't there on the third day, the fact that there really was a man named Jesus who really did die on the cross. There's letters from Pilate. Then you really start to form, and of course there's many others, but you really start to form a pretty solid inductive argument for God. And you start to form that bundle of sticks that can't be broken as easily. And the conversion of Clovis really sealed Christianity as an influential force in the West going into the medieval era. And yeah, and that's an argument for God in human events from the conversion of Clovis. Now, you could do something with Constantine, and the conversion of Constantine is more documented and is probably a better argument, especially with things like the Edict of Milan. So you can't just say that they were just willy-nilly reporting about the conversion of Constantine, because there's literally an edict that comes after. So obviously something happened there. But the conversion of Clovis is pretty consequential as well. And yeah, and I guess that'll be the end of this. It's 11:30. And yeah, oh, one more thing. The Merovingians are no more. And now we have what would come to be known as the Carolingians because of Charlemagne. So we're moving into the era of Charlemagne, which was a huge figure, and I could talk about him as well, but that's where I'm going to end it tonight. So thank you guys for watching, I guess. Bye.